Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started here. I'll invite you to use the Q&A box, the button that says Q&A at the bottom of your screen, for any questions you have for the speaker today. Or if you're having any Zoom issues, why let me know and maybe I can talk you through it. On the screen right now, also, you'll see a list of our remaining webinars in this series about fertility management given high fertilizer prices. Today's the March 16th event. We're going to be hearing from Jeff Miller about small grain and soybean fertility. Jeff is my friend and colleague. He's a senior resource educator at CCE Oneida County. He's had regional responsibilities too across Oneida, Herkimer, and Madison for 7 years. He's been the ag program leader there in Oneida for 17 years, and he's been with Cornell Cooperative Extension for a total of 36 years. And in that role, he's an excellent collaborator, working with lots of Cornell people, New York State IPM staff, and others on various research projects that impact his growers in Oneida and beyond across the state. He has a weekly electronic newsletter that you may want to subscribe to where he provides current crop information, stage of development of different crops as the season goes on, information about pest outbreaks and management ideas as the season goes forward. So, Jeff, I will stop sharing this screen. I should also mention, folks, that we do have a CCA credit available today, and there will be a QR code at the end of the presentation and some additional information for you to retrieve that credit. Take it away, Jeff. Oh, hey, I got your presenter screen.
Okay.
Hey, that's better.
Don't mind me, I'm dawdling here. Okay, so thanks for coming, guys. Yeah, so my focus today is going to be optimizing soil fertility in small grains and soybeans. I first want to stop and thank Mike Standard and Jody Latham, Green Ketterings, for providing a lot of the content of what you're going to hear in the next hour or so. Green Ketterings worked with field staff and other folks, and now has 125 fact sheets up on the web on nutrient management issues. So I would just suggest, if you have an opportunity at some time, to go visit the Cornell Nutrient Management SPEAR program website. It's a wealth of information there. I do also want to thank Kitty and Janice Degney for their help in collaboration in a number of different webinars over the years and this particular series. And then we'll move on. So the first thing that I'm going to cover is winter wheat. And whenever you're talking about small grains, one of the things that you probably want to know a little bit about is the stages of development. And there are different scales out there people use, and FIGS is just one of them, one of the popular ones. And it's a numeric scale. Just get a laser pointer up. So it goes from 1 to 11. And 1 through 5 is the tillering phase. 6 through 10 is extension, and then 10 and above is heading and ripening. Some of the important parts is, this tillering phase. Hitting stage 6 is, you can see the first node visible on the stem. Boot stage, you can actually feel the head still in the stem, not yet emerged, but at the top of the stem. And those are really important markers as far as timing related to a lot of things: nitrogen management, fungicide applications, if you're applying some sort of growth regulators, when to apply the growth regulators. So some important things to know. In addition, I'm going to be talking about using soil tests recommendations for your fertility program. I do want to qualify that, that what I'll be suggesting that you use is soil tests with a Morgan extraction. This is the soil test that was developed and used by Cornell to develop all these recommendations that I'll be talking about. The Morgan extraction, as explained by Janice last week, is a weak acid. There are other extractants, malic, bray, and they're more stronger acids. And you can picture, leaching a soil sample that you sent in with an acid that a weaker acid is going to remove or leach out less nutrient than stronger acids. And the reason why it's being used in our area is we have younger soils, and that was also explained by Janice very well. We had probably the nearest glaciation, the last glaciation hit our area and deposited soils. So our soils are younger than those down south of us, less weathered. And so that's why the weak acid just seemed to work better than the other choices as far as mimicking what availability there is of these nutrients for crops in our area. So just looking at this, these are the soil test values that Cornell has derived for New York State soils. On the left, you see grouping of soil management, so 1 through 5. 1 is your smallest particle size, so clay soils. 2 is your silts. 3 are some of these bony silts. And then 5 is sandy, much coarser soils. And you'll see that there's definitely an impact on at least potassium levels. You see that the rate of potassium goes up as you get to more coarser soils. And that's because those soils just can't hold on to the potassium. So you need to apply more in season to affect good crop development. So the other thing about soil tests is whether they're verified, the recommendations are verified through in-field research within the area that you're growing your crops. And that's another reason why I suggest people going to this Morgan extraction, because it is the baseline used by Cornell. And Cornell's, land grant institution in New York State that's done all the field plot studies. And this is just an example of what a field plot study looks like. You can picture that, you're growing a crop, and you're working. It's like us working with field staff working with growers in our area, and them planting a crop and doing everything else that they normally would do, weed control, etc., and allowing us to set up field plots, and in this case, studying the response of that crop to a fertilizer. And maybe we'll take phosphorus as an example and say that that's the study that we're doing. And so we have field plots in their fields and rates of phosphorus fertilizer varying from 0, 50, 100, 150, maybe 200. And 4 replicates of each one of those treatments in that same field with all other nutrients held at levels that are not limiting growth and development. And so we're just studying what is the response of this crop to this one fertilizer source. And let's say this is a response to fertilizer phosphorus. So yield increases as the rate of phosphorus increases, but only to a point, and then it levels off. And there's no response to the additional phosphorus fertilizer that's being applied. And so in all of these studies in fields across the state, they took soil tests beforehand, determined the phosphorus level using that Morgan extractant, and it fit into those classifications like low, very low, medium, optimal, and high and very high. And That was documented for each one of those fields, and then those rates 0 through 200 were applied, and yields were determined for each one of those plots in all of the replicates. And they developed this recommendation to say, okay, so here's where the yield is maximum, roughly, and at 90% of maximum, that's the maximum, or that's the maximum economic rate of that fertilizer source, given the soil test value that it was earned at. And so the recommendations developed by Cornell are based on all of those field studies in New York State. So you can have a lot of faith in, you know, that they're giving you the rates that you need for optimal yields. So fertility is just like one aspect of growing a crop, and you really have to do all the best management practices to come up with the best yields, including the fertility piece. So I want to, for each of the 4 crops that I'm going to discuss, talk to you about some of those best management practices. So for winter wheat, it starts with planting date. So you want to plant as soon as you can after the Hessian fly-free date. And you have to look at a regional map to see when that is. It's affected by temperature. It's going to be affected by elevation within your zone. So you want to find out what that is for your area. You want to plant into soils that are moderately to well drained. You want a pH between 6 and 6.3. You want to plant 1.3 million live seeds per acre. And that means that you have to go to the seed bag and you have to determine what the percentage live seed is. And if it's not 100%, which it won't be, let's say it's 90%, well, that means that you have to apply more than 1.3 million live seeds to get that number in the field. And so if it's at 90%, you have to really apply 1.4 million live seeds per acre to get that 1.3 million plants. Date is also a factor in that seeding rate. This is a seeding rate for a mid-September planting. If you're delayed to mid-October, you want to raise that level of seed planting to 1.5 million live seeds per acre. So it's date and its location and its percent live seed. You want to plant at 1 to 1.5 inch seeding depths consistently. You want to base your fertilizer applications on your soil test. You want to do some fertilization at planting, but also some fertilization in the spring. You want to spend time and effort on weed control, insect management if it's needed, and disease control. And I want to explain 2 different systems, a conventional and intensive management of wheat. So we'll start off with some of these nutrients and their function within wheat. So you look at nitrogen, one of the first things that you'll learn is that, yes, it can increase the number of tillers. Number of tillers equals number of heads enhances yield. It also affects biomass production, so very important to straw yields as well. And it does increase the amount of protein within your harvested grain. Phosphorus, very involved in the energy cycle within plants and also in protein metabolism. Potassium definitely impacts the ion levels within the plant. And it also controls the amount of moisture that's lost through transpiration. Sulfur is an important component in producing proteins within the plant, and in wheat, it's very involved in wheat gluten. Boron is something that affects formation of flowers, pollination, and cation absorption like calcium, magnesium, potassium. Zinc is an integral part in several enzyme processes within the plant. So very important, and micros as well as macros. I do want to make the point that excess nutrient levels can be just as bad as deficiencies. You know, I think people sometimes think of the soil as a bank, and it doesn't matter if you oversupply any particular nutrient in that bank, it'll just be there for some future date. And unfortunately, excess amounts of some nutrients interfere with the uptake and utilization of other nutrients. As an example, nitrogen in excess can impact potassium and calcium. Phosphorus in excess can cause problems with uptake of zinc, copper, and iron. So really, our goal should be maintaining moderate levels of nutrients that are not limiting to plant growth. So now this is a table taken right out of the Cornell guide. Again, it's the result of all those field studies and Morgan extraction. And these are the recommendations that you would get for, in this case, winter wheat, not forage seeded. The recommendation for nitrogen for conventional production would be 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. If you had very low levels of phosphorus, you'd be recommended to apply 65 pounds of P2O5 per acre. If you had very high levels of phosphorus, you're still recommended to apply 10 pounds of P2O5 per acre. And the rationale for that is phosphorus's behavior within the soil. If you broadcast phosphorus, so you spin it on and each one of those prills comes into contact with soil, then some reactions can start to occur immediately. Tying up that phosphorus, whether it's in calcium, with calcium or magnesium at high pHs, or with iron and aluminum at low pHs, it forms a product that is not available for plant uptake. So having 10 pounds of available phosphorus close to where that seedling is developing is a very important thing. Unlike phosphorus, potassium acts very differently in the soil. It actually fits between the clay layers, and as the amount of potassium in the soil water decreases, the potassium comes out from those clay layers to go into the soil water and eventually into plants. So you see that there is no need for potassium when you have very high levels, unlike with phosphorus. So just taking that chart in a different way, if you got a really low soil test P, so 1 pound per acre, then you're recommended to apply 65 pounds of P2O5 per acre. One of the things that I read recently, that 1/10 of 1% of the phosphorus in the soil is available at any given time. So that's like that 1 pound, if that's truly available, a good measure of available phosphorus, represents 1,000 pounds of phosphorus in the soil that's just not available for plant uptake. If you look at the higher end, so now at 40, okay, a lot of phosphorus in the soil, but the recommendation is still to apply 15 to 20 pounds, and that's available phosphorus for that seedling. The other thing about phosphorus that you should know is that it is pretty much immobile in the soil. So band applying first to reduce the amount of contact between the prills and soil to keep it basically active and available for uptake is the first part. And putting that band close by where the seedling is developing, because it's going to be root contact that actually helps the plant get that phosphorus. Those are the two keys when managing phosphorus fertilization. Potassium, again, readily available in the soil water. At the low end, higher rate is 75 pounds. At the high level of potassium in the soil, you're not going to see a response to any additional potassium fertilizer. So just talking about fertilization of wheat at planting, all of your phosphorus should be applied at planting, preferably in the band, with or next to the seed. And one of the other characteristics of phosphorus, it's not really a salt, so it's not going to burn your seed, so you can put it right in the row. If you were forced to broadcast phosphorus, which there's not a lot of drills in my area that can apply, that have fertilizer hoppers and coulters to open up a row to drop that phosphorus fertilizer in. So if you have to broadcast, literally you have to apply 4 times the rate to get the same impact. I will say that a way that growers can apply fertilizer in row is to set up a tank, a pump, and lines that are directing the fertilizer right into the open planted row and dribble the fertilizer right in row. And that's something that I think is starting to happen. And one of the common fertilizers, a liquid fertilizer you could apply, is 1034O. And you can apply that at 50 pounds per acre roughly and get that 15 pounds of phosphorus that is needed by the seedlings as they develop. All of your potassium, which potassium is a salt, just like nitrogen, can be broadcast ahead of planting. If you can't get it on before planting, maybe you can just surface apply in the spring. Lime should be applied prior to the planting the crop, and you should be at a pH of 6 or higher at that time. So now we get into nitrogen management. The nitrogen rate, the source, and the timing are important to optimize wheat yields. In grain production, there's definitely this balance between supplying enough nitrogen for yield, but not too much to avoid lodging. Growers should be attempting to quantify the nitrogen coming from other sources, like the previous crop. So in my area, a lot of times soybeans precede wheat, and so you have to give a credit to the amount of nitrogen that is available after a soybean crop. You also have to consider crop residue, manure, and soil organic matter. Variety selection is very important, especially for those people that are looking at intensive wheat production. And when you look at the charts on Seedsman's pamphlets, you'll see that they rate the heights a lot of times, and they rate lodging. And so if you're going for high wheat production, not only are you looking for yield, but shorter heights and better lodging scores. So when I talk about intensive management of wheat, I'm talking about people that are going for that maximum population. They've selected very specific wheat varieties. They're using plant growth regulators to reduce the size of the plants. And here's some of those products: Ethipon, which is another name for Cerone, which has been around for a long time, Chlormequat, and Palisade. And you'd want to look at the labels for the best timing for each one of those because it's different. That intensive management also would include multiple fungicide applications if necessary, and insecticides, again, if necessary. So this is information that was sent to me by Mike Stanyard, and a group of farmers out his way that are collaborating on research, and they are definitely looking at intensive production, and they're looking at 100 bushel per acre yields year over year. And their information says it's about 2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel that's required to get those yields. Now they start accounting for where is that nitrogen coming from. 25 pounds is coming from nitrate in the soil. If you look at organic matter, the rough estimate is 20 pounds of nitrogen per percent, 1% of organic matter. So in this case, 2% organic matter, 40 pounds of nitrogen. A planting application of 1034O at 150 pounds gives you 15 pounds of nitrogen. A soybean N credit of 20 pounds, that's a little bit on the conservative side. So that's 100 pounds from these sources. And then they look at doing tiller counts, and at a tiller count of 450 tillers per square yard, they're recommending 45 pounds of nitrogen at green up, to be followed by another 55 pounds of nitrogen just before the extension phase, so GS5 and 6. So you can look at this very differently. If you're in conventional production, you're not using growth regulators, multiple applications of fungicides, etc. You can look at your own experience with lodging on your farm to give you guidance as to what rate of nitrogen to apply. So if you in your fields experience lodging on a regular basis, then maybe you want to reduce your nitrogen application to 10 to 20 pounds per acre. If it's occasional lodging, 20 to 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre. If you don't really experience lodging, 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Basically, a little bit applied at planting and the rest applied at green up. Some folks have tried, conventional growers have tried splitting nitrogen applications between green up and stem elongation, and at least locally have not really found that much of a response. Obviously, intensive growers are going to apply a lot more nitrogen. So those people that are doing intensive wheat management are out in their fields at green up, and they're counting plants and tillers. So they'll take a yardstick out to the fields, count the actual number of plants per yard in several locations, dig out a minimum of 10 plants, look at the number of tillers per plant, multiply the average of the number of plants and the average number of tillers, and then multiply that resultant by 4.8 to get number of tillers per square yard. So that's what a tiller looks like dug out. And then if you now have a count of tillers less than 300, then the recommendation is to apply 60 units of nitrogen at green up. So again, we talked about the fact that nitrogen can actually enhance tiller production. So low number of tillers, that first application of nitrogen is the larger application of nitrogen with the rest applied at extension. 450 to 600, this is, I guess, more of the optimal. Now you're splitting that nitrogen up, 45 units of nitrogen at green up and the same at the extension phase. If you have a large number of tillers, you don't really need to promote more tiller production, so low amount of nitrogen at green up and the rest applied later. And then the amount that's applied later, just before the extension phase, the thought pattern is more of that is going to go into head production and grain fill. So heavier, denser seeds. So we talked about the fact that source is also important in production. So this is just one study, OMAFRA in Canada, 19 different locations looking at liquid nitrogen versus solid nitrogen applied at the same rate of nitrogen. And so you have the liquid, 28%, and you have the yields from urea, the solid fertilizer source. Again, same nitrogen rates, consistently higher for the liquid that's being applied. And you can look up many studies that show the same thing. Stream bars, this is a stream bar, so it's attaching right to your boom, and it spreads the application out in this case into 4 different drip lines. You can see what it does, you know, that these, you do have better distribution, right? And you have large drip sizes. And so one of the things that they found out right away, less burning, less leaf burning, and a better distribution, which you would think would mean less nitrogen volatilization. And again, you know, you can look up these studies on your own, but here are 2 nozzles with multiple holes per nozzle, and yields are compared with the stream bar. And you can see that the stream bar improves on yield. I do have to mention the green seeker, although I don't really see anything in my area related to this, but if you can picture a boom sprayer applying a liquid fertilizer, in this case nitrogen, right? And each one of the boom sections having a controller on it that can actually allow you to do variable rates of nitrogen as you cross the field, and a sensor that's actually measuring the reflection of light coming off of your canopy, and basically with this reading adjusting for its part of the boom what rate of nitrogen to apply in that boom section on the fly as you're driving through the field. Now there's a couple of things that you have to know about that. You have to have an enriched strip, so you have to have a strip in every one of those fields that you oversupplied nitrogen. You're going to run your machine over that area so the sensor picks up that wavelength of light or amount of light that is being reflected and set that at 0. That's no nitrogen for those areas. And then you have had to do some research beforehand to set up, okay, so now it's 1/3 of that light, well, then the rate has to go up. It's 1/4 of that reflection, now it goes up even further. So there's a lot of work involved in setting this up so it's actually applying the appropriate amount of nitrogen. And one of the growers in my area tried it once, and one of the things they learned immediately is that this works much better if you have not applied nitrogen in the field in the spring and you're running this across the field, basically applying all the nitrogen for that field. If you have too high of a nitrogen rate, you're really not, you're paying for this ability to vary the rate, but you're not going to see much return on your investment because it's going to basically apply the same rate.
Jeff, I have a question, and it looks like this is a good time to ask you.
Sure.
Mike asks, there was some sulfur in the liquid analysis for the wheat. What is the maximum sulfur you'd recommend, and how would it be split up?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There isn't really good research on the topic of how much sulfur needs to be applied, unfortunately. And we're going to get into that right now. And the recommendation is to apply 15 pounds of sulfur per acre if you think that there's going to be a deficiency. And, you know, moving along that line, okay, the reason why we're concerned about sulfur is what? We had a reduction in air pollution, right? And with that, acid rain. And acid rain contains sulfur. So now we have this potential need for sulfur in our field crops. The thing that should be underscored is that we see those sulfur deficiency first in coarse soils, sandy soils, and low organic matter. So those are the fields that you really want to look at more closely. For the dairy farmers that are in the group here, if you have semi-regular manure applications, you probably don't have to worry about sulfur because you're applying enough sulfur through your manure applications. Again, limited research on actual sulfur needs of wheat. As far as the timing goes, sulfur acts similar to nitrogen in the soil. So timing wise, I would think that the spring application is when you'd want to apply the sulfur. If deficiency exists or is expected, again, the general recommendation is to apply 15 pounds per acre. Moving on to micronutrients, there are 8 essential plant nutrient elements considered to be micronutrients: zinc, copper, manganese, iron, boron, molybdenum, chloride, and nickel. And very similar to the macro elements, if they're in a supply that's lower than what the need of the plants are, it's going to affect crop yields. Again, growers with fields that receive manure semi-regularly probably don't have to worry about micros. But grain producers who have lower organic matter levels and no history of applying micros should be definitely reviewing their soil test results to see if that's something that they need to improve on. And yes, no-till cooler soils can impact the release of and availability of micronutrients. So again, you should be considering micronutrient levels and looking at soil test reports. So back to the Cornell guide, and this is taken right out of it, and looking at some of the micronutrients and sufficiency levels, you can look at, and again, this is that Morgan extraction. You can look at boron levels that are slightly below 1 as being adequate for production. And you can see that if you're at 1/3 of that, then you want to start applying a micronutrient as part of your program. Zinc, kind of the same thing, a little bit less than 1. You're definitely in a good place. If you have a numeric value of 1/2, then you have to start addressing that. So another way to check on your fertility program is tissue sampling. And you can't willy-nilly any time of the year just grab a sample and say, okay, this is something that I can get information from. You have to really pick the time and the thing that you're going to sample to get results that you can compare with other people's results. And so if you're trying to get an early sample and look at whether it's macronutrients or micronutrients, then you want to take a sample just before extension phase, and you want to take whole plants, and you want to take a lot of them, like 50 of them. If you wait a little bit longer, and this is more, you're not going to be able to do very much about it at this point in time, but at flag leaf stage, so the last leaf that comes out of the stem, grab 4 leaves, the 4 upper leaves of the plant on 15 to 20 plants. Those are the samples that you send into the lab. Then you can compare it and actually have comparisons with data that's been produced by a lot of other people at those stages. And you can look and compare your results and say, okay, so my nitrogen was 1.8, I'm in really good shape. My phosphorus was 0.23, I'm in good shape. My potassium was 0.5. Wait a minute, that's something that I have to start working on. And so those are the macros. Sulfur, the level that you want in that leaf that's normal, optimal, is 0.15% by dry weight or dry weight. So, again, what I would say is maybe somewhere you're going to find that you're in this excess category, and that's also very good information for you. So I'm going to shift now to triticale, and specifically triticale for forage production. So now completely different objective in mind, right? We're growing this plant in mass to produce high biomass yields with high protein levels, and we want to harvest it at a time so that there's really good digestibility. So very different than the small grain management that we've talked about so far. So the best management practices, Tom Kilser would say plant it in the middle of August, because you definitely get a big gain in yields if you do so. But unfortunately, most growers in my area, if they're considering this crop, they're going to plant after the corn silage harvest. And that for us is at earliest first week in September, maybe second week in September. You want to apply a fair amount of seed, again, to get good fall tillering. So 100 to 125 pounds per acre of high quality seed. You want to plant at 1¼ inch depth to prevent winter injury. And you want to harvest just before flag leaf stage to get the best digestibility. So developed for this crop, for triticale, planted in the winter and harvested as forage in the spring, these were the rates of phosphorus that were determined to be best based on soil test phosphorus levels. So 40 is pretty high, right? That's very high in the Cornell standard, still suggesting 10 pounds of P2O5 per acre, okay? When you're less than 10 pounds, as far as the soil test value, you use this formula, 85 minus 5 times the soil test phosphorus. That's the rate that you need to apply. So let's just say we had, I don't know, 4 is the value, 5 times 4 is 20, 85 minus 20 is 65 pounds of phosphorus to be applied. Potassium, similar formulation based on the soil test potassium. So 110 minus the amount of soil test potassium, the value from the soil test, times 0.7. So if you take an example of 53 pounds is the actual number that you get back with your soil test for potassium. It's 110 minus 53, which gives you 47, times 0.7 is 39.9. So you're applying 40 pounds of K2O per acre. Okay, so now the goal of nitrogen management. Now you got to picture this again. When is the crop planted? Middle of September to middle October is kind of the latest. So what are the soil temperatures then? And when are you harvesting? Mid-May to the 3rd week in May, generally speaking. During that time, soil temperatures are definitely fairly low, right? So low microbial activity. And that's definitely something that I think people should consider when they think about the nitrogen sources. So the goal of nitrogen management, again, is higher yields, protein content for a high quality forage. And so you want to shoot for 19% protein for dairy cows, milking dairy cows, and 16 for dry cows and heifers. My suggestion, because of this cool soil temperatures, is not really to count manure nitrogen in your equation of figuring out how much nitrogen you want to apply. because I don't think it's going to be really available during the time that you're growing this crop. You want 20 pounds minimum nitrogen, well now really 20 pounds of nitrogen at the time of planting, because excessive amounts of nitrogen can support snow mold. So don't overdo it in the fall. And then at least 50 pounds of nitrogen at green up in the spring. And I'll say we had 2 studies in my area. Field staff like myself across the state participated with green in these studies. And the 2 studies, I think it was 2013 and 2014 in our area, 2 different farms, one in Verona, one in Westmoreland. The maximum economic rate of nitrogen in both of those studies was 90 pounds of nitrogen. And a lot of people balk at that because, yeah, 90 pounds, that's a lot, right? But you have to think about the crop again. Okay, so yield is one component, but protein content is the other. And that's the thing when you look at what is the price of soybean meal today, it's like $4.20 a ton or something like that. It's not only the value in total yield, but the protein that it's going to replace. And so more nitrogen equals more protein. And that's why the rate, the MERN, maximum economic rate for nitrogen, was this high for that particular crop. Obviously, you're applying at a green up. Because you're applying it to a standing crop, you should consider weather. So if you got rain immediately in the forecast, great. If not, you should consider a urease inhibitor. And what does a urease inhibitor do? It inhibits the conversion of urea to ammonia. It reduces the losses of from ammonia volatilization, and the products that are out there can protect that nitrogen loss for 10 to 14 days, depending on the rate that you're applying. Now we're going to move into spring small grain fertilization. So we were talking about winter crops up until now. And the first one we'll talk about is oats. So the soil pH should be 6. You're basing your fertilization on soil test results. You're choosing varieties with crown rust resistant. And there's 3 that I know of, and talk to your seedsman about others. Drill at 3 bushels per acre. So that's roughly 100 pounds as soon as possible in the spring. So this is in April, and it's whenever the soil moisture is right for planting. All of your nitrogen and potassium can be applied and incorporated before planting. Those people that want to try this, you can split apply the nitrogen and apply half of it in late May. I don't really see an awful lot of people doing that. They just don't have the time to get back into the field to do that. Phosphorus, all the phosphorus should be applied in the row at planting. So this is back to pretty much the same chart that we had before, right? Only we're now in spring grains, right? Not forage seeded. Okay, so I should mention for the dairy farmers out there that yes, it is a practice to put a nurse crop of oats over your forage seeding. You have to look at that forage seeding as the primary crop that you're growing, right? And you want that to be lasting for the next 4 years in front of you. So you got to be really careful about putting too much oats on top and suffocating that seeding. So usually a bushel per acre will do it. And I wouldn't be pushing nitrogen, because if I've got a legume grass mix, I want that legume to dominate, right? Because we want that legume to be 70% or more of the stand for several years. So we really want to push the things that are good for the forage seeding. In this case, we're talking about oats just planted by themselves. So not forage seeded. Again, 10 pounds of phosphorus, even though the phosphorus level here is very high, and that's to provide an available source for that seedling. Okay, root contact by that seedling. Obviously, the rate goes up to 50 when your phosphorus levels are low. And when you compare the two, winter versus spring grain, less phosphorus needed. And it kind of makes sense because you're going to have less plant material in total there, right? And the same reaction to potassium. If you got high levels of potassium, you're not going to see a response to potassium fertilizer. If you're very low, you definitely want to apply enough to meet the crop needs. So we're going to shift again to malting barley. Okay, so some folks in the area grow winter barley, and Other than the intensive nitrogen rates that we talked about for winter wheat, pretty much winter barley would be fertilized the same exact way for P and K, et cetera, and pH. Now we're talking about a spring. Well, we're talking about malting barley, which can be either winter or spring. But we're going to talk about malting barley, which again, very different objectives here, very different than growing barley for feed grain. And I have a 2-row and a 6-row barley variety here. So talking about best management practices for malting barley production. pH of 6.3, well-drained soil, choosing the variety based on market demand. If you don't have a market, you should be growing malting barley. You should be knowing exactly who you're selling it to and agreed upon a rate per bushel, et cetera. And the reason being is each variety has their own characteristics, and you're thinking this is going to be malted and then brewed into a beer. And some of those characteristics, the flavor, et cetera, is going to be related to the variety itself. So you want to talk to the maltster that you're going to sell to and say, okay, so what variety do you want, and grow that particular variety. Powdery mildew and scalds are the most common early season diseases. And you can look at the information about the variety and see what kind of resistance it might have to those two diseases. And if not, be prepared to scout and apply fungicide if necessary. There are definitely strict standards for DON, which is a mycotoxin produced by the disease Fusarium graminearum, and you have to be below 1.1 part per million of DON for it to be acceptable. So that makes it essential to apply a triazole fungicide at head emergence. There's strict standards for malting and brewing qualities. Your protein standard is the protein has to be greater than 9%, but less than 12.5%. So you talk about threading the needle, that's what you're talking about here. And nitrogen is a significant part of protein. So nitrogen rate, timing, source is definitely going to be impactful on protein content. The other thing that they want from you is high seed germination rate. The malting process is germinating that seed. So they want 90% or better. And that means that you have to time your harvest very well to avoid sprouting, because that's what they want to do, is sprout that wheat. Barley. So crop rotation is another important factor. Corn traditionally is going to have some level of that Fusarium disease. So if you can set up your rotation so that malting barley is not following corn production, that's going to help you out as far as disease management. So talking about malting barley fertilization, fertilization is based on soil tests, very similarly to other small grains. All the P should be applied at planting. K, the potassium should be applied pre-plant. All sources of nitrogen need to be accounted for. This is really significant for this crop because of the loss of the value of the crop if the protein levels are not where they need to be. So you have to look at the previous crop residue, soil organic matter, and do your best at estimating how much nitrogen is coming from those sources. Winter barley, 10 to 20 pounds of nitrogen planting, the remainder at green up. Spring barley, all the nitrogen at green up. So nitrogen rates have not been thoroughly investigated in the Northeast. So that tells you right away that you're going to be doing your own testing in your own fields and learning through the process. You have to be very cautious to account for all nitrogen sources. It's really tough to hit that protein requirement. It's better to go lower than higher. Nitrogen should be applied at green up, because what we talked about before, the later application definitely is pushing more into the grain, and that can increase protein beyond acceptable levels. So nitrogen rates may be guideline, but really nitrogen rates should be based on growers' experience of rates and protein levels. that's really what you should base it on. So it's kind of a learn as you go. This is general guidance. So now we're going to move into soybeans. Soybeans, before you plant, should be at a pH of 6.5 to 7. You can plant into moderately well to well-drained soils. Most of the growers are growing in 30-inch row spacing, and most of them are planting at 140,000 live seeds per acre. The reason why they're going with 30-inch row spacing is because the main disease problem in soybeans is white mold, and having a 30-inch row spacing allows air drainage for a longer period of time. When the canopy closes, that creates a trap for moisture coming from the soil, more humidity, and really good conditions for white mold development. So a lot of people have gone to 30-inch rows. Another reason why they've gone to the 30-inch rows, they didn't really see a huge yield response to going to narrow rows like 7.5s. Variety selection, maturity group selection is key. You can definitely work with local seedsmen. A lot of the seedsmen in the area do a great job doing the variety plots within different regions that people can visit and look at and review the yield results from those trials. And so you can really see how productive these varieties are. You may want to choose some early maturity varieties, depending on what situation you have. If you have moderately well drained fields and you know that it's a hassle harvesting a lot of times in the fall, maybe you want to choose an early maturity variety to avoid that headache. Obviously, you're going to be looking at yields. If you have herbicide resistant weeds to contend with on your farm, maybe you're making your selection partially on a herbicide tolerant variety that you can use to control those specific weeds. And maybe you're looking at high oleic oil soybeans because they have a premium price on them at this point in time. You definitely want to double inoculate with rhizobia. That's very cheap insurance. Planting early. This is something, you know, a lot of tradition. Let's plant the corn first, and then when we're done with the corn, we'll start on the soybeans. Definitely people are finding that if they plant their soybeans early, that they're rewarded in better yields. So this is one of those situations, if you have fields that are ready to be planted to corn because of the soil temperatures, moisture content, you should be planting corn. If those conditions are less than viable for corn and you're in May, maybe you should be considering planting soybeans. Timely weed control is very important to yield. And then scouting for the major pests, white mold, soybean aphids, soybean cyst nematode is very important to overall production. Looking at fertility, these are the soil test values, okay, for soybean production. And if you look at these categories, the phosphorus, potassium, very similar, you know, to what we saw before. But soybeans require twice the amount of magnesium. So that's something to be aware of. And what is our source of magnesium? Yes, you can buy Magox, magnesium oxide. You can buy Sulpomag, also contains magnesium. But a lot of people are going to bring magnesium onto the farm in the form of lime. And so you would just look at a soil test results, and in the recommendation, not in the boxes that say so many pounds of NP and K, but below that, there's a series of notes. And in the notes, it's going to say, okay, if you have low magnesium levels, it's going to say apply X number of tons of lime per acre at 3% magnesium. And that's how you're going to apply your magnesium to the field. This is the actual recommendations for soybeans. And if you look again, even at very high levels of soil test phosphorus, there's a recommendation of 20 pounds of phosphorus. That's again, a readily available source of phosphorus planted nearby where your seed is being placed. And again, same issue with potassium. If you're very high, there's not going to be a response to additional potassium. And I think that's one of the things, a lot of people apply a lot of potassium in our area. The other thing, this is a legume, and you say, well, why do you need to apply nitrogen? It basically produces its own. Well, it doesn't really start producing its own until it's the third trifoliate stage. So definitely uses nitrogen, soil nitrogen, up until that point in time to fuel growth and development. And one of the things that I look at, at least in my area, is most soybeans are following what crop? Corn. And when we look at varieties and how much crop residue they produce nowadays, there's an awful lot of corn crop residue, especially grain harvest. And that's what I usually see is corn for grain, and then follow that with soybeans. You're leaving all that trash on the surface, very high carbon rate, very low nitrogen rate. And so the bugs in the soil look at that and say, wow, this is like, candy. We're eating all this sugar, the carbon, but they need, some amount of nitrogen to produce that many more microbes in the soil. And so where do they get the nitrogen from? The soil. And what are they competing with? Your soybean crop. So I definitely see more and more people who see some yellow beans in the spring and say, what's happening here? And they should be considering applying that 20-pound rate of nitrogen along with their P and K in the springtime. And basically what they're doing is either feeding the bugs or feeding the plants and letting the bugs take the soil nitrogen that was already there. But something definitely to consider. So when we look at the fertilizer best management practices for soybeans, and I think maybe, yeah, pH 6, 5 to 7, apply P and K based on soil tests. Nitrogen and all the phosphorus should be applied in the band at planting. Depending on the rate of potassium that's needed, you don't want to get too heavy with nitrogen and potassium in the band because, you can have a salt effect. So potassium is better applied broadcast and separate from nitrogen and the phosphorus. Obviously, if you're broadcasting, you have to increase your phosphorus rate. Again, magnesium requirements are double. So you want to make sure that you look at that and make sure that you're applying enough magnesium, and that if it's a lime source, you're putting this on in advance of the crop. We talked about the fact that there's no research backing for sulfur rates in wheat, and it's pretty much the same for sulfur rates for soybeans. There was a soil test developed, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. And again, just a second reminder that if you're following corn grain with soybeans, you should definitely think about applying nitrogen at planting to overcome that tie-up period. So specifically looking at sulfur, one of the things that you can do is a foliar analysis. So taking 2 to 3 fully developed leaves from the top of the plant, and having 20 leaves at a minimum, and basically doing an analysis of that foliar material. You should have 0.21% or roughly around that for adequate supply. So you can take soil samples 0 to 8 inches taken just before planting. You can analyze that sample using a 0.01 molar calcium chloride or strontium chloride extraction to best reflect plant available sulfur. That's a test that Corrine came up with after trying a bunch of different tests. She wasn't very happy with the Morgan sulfur level and its ability to actually predict what sulfur is needed by the crop. So she did a bunch of experimenting. That's what she came up with, is a different extraction method specifically for sulfur, and work with extension staff related to alfalfa foliar sampling that was done in bonier, sandy, low organic matter soils to determine the sulfur rate required for alfalfa using this soil test, and she found a critical value of 8 parts per million sulfur was the critical level for alfalfa, but there is no critical level established for soybeans as of yet. This is basically Penn State's database on foliar analyses and for soybeans. And again, like if you're 4% by dry weight for nitrogen, you're in good shape. 0.26% phosphorus, 1.71% potassium. Sulfur, you want to be 0.21% in that foliar analysis. So Ag Journal, several groups out there, Bex, et cetera, they do field studies. This particular study, 3-year research project examining sulfur response in soybeans, found a response to ammonium sulfate applied at the 3rd trifoliate stage. And it's kind of unique that that's the same stage when the rhizobia become active. And they found a 4 bushel yield response, but they didn't have information about soil levels of sulfur or foliar levels. And the suggestion, and this is a great suggestion for anybody out there, is take a little time and do your own strips to see whether you see a response to sulfur or not. So we have a couple more classes in this webinar series. Next Thursday, March 23rd, Dale Dewing from Delaware County will be talking about alfalfa, grass, mixed stands, and pasture fertility in times of peak fertilizer prices. And that'll be the same time frame, 12:30 to 1:30. And on March 30th, Green Ketterings, Subha, Sanaj, and Manuel will be talking to you about using precision technologies to improve nutrient efficiency and save fertilizer costs. So both should be very interesting subjects. I will say that every one of the webinars that we've done have been recorded. I try to make the link available to those people that signed up for, even if they didn't participate in the event. I send the link to them so they can view it if they missed it. But I also have posted it to our website, and along with a whole bunch of other videos. And if you missed one of these segments and want to see it, you'll find it there. We'll make sure that we relay that to you in an email later on. I'll take questions if you guys have questions. And I'm gonna have to put up this CCA slide for folks.
Jeff, as you're doing that, I missed my chance to relay a question while you were talking about barley. So you got to put your barley hat back on.
Okay.
Mike asks, is there any correlation between tissue test and N rate in the season on barley?
For barley, not that I know of. I can't say that I know a lot about barley production. We really haven't seen, in my area, there's very few people that actually produce barley for grain production. Although it's a pretty good secondary crop compared to corn as far as what nutrition it provides for livestock. So it is, a good second thing if, I don't know, if you were skunked on planting and wanted to plant something similar, I don't know. I think it was one of those options, but the answer is no, I don't really know what the foliar levels are. I could definitely look them up for you because I'm sure Penn State has something on that. And if you want, I have your email address. I'll just follow up with you individually and let you know what I find out.